As a public health professional and researcher, I know data tells a story. Without data, there's no clear evidence that a problem exists. Hundreds of communities hold stories of truth from generation to generation. Our communities know which relatives have yet to return to their families. We must help tell them. We must help have those stories told by giving them tools and resources to do so, and eventually bringing the lost ones home. Madzigidads, and thank you for allowing me to testify before you.
Thank you, Representative. Next, we'd like to introduce Ms. Mary Catherine Nagel. She's legal counsel of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Gallego, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Paul Cook, and all other members of the committee. Thank you so much for inviting me here today and for your time and consideration of this very important issue. I'm honored to represent as legal counsel to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, a national nonprofit dedicated to the restoration of tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction to protect and save the lives of Native women and children. The NIWRC has played a critical role in raising awareness around the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis here in the United States today. The NIWRC has hosted numerous educational trainings, briefings on the Hill. They've hosted screenings of educational films, held candlelight vigils, and collaborated with local grassroots organizations to generate support for a national day of awareness for missing and murdered Native women and girls. Our main office is in Lame Deer, Montana, and so our staff directly experienced the losses of both Henny Scott and Hannah Harris. This is a crisis that strikes at home, and it strikes deep. In September of 2018, the NIWRC hosted a candlelight vigil at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. We were honored that Congresswoman Gwen Moore came and spoke about the importance of the restoration of tribal jurisdiction, supplementing with tribal resources to tribal law enforcement, and compelling the federal government to take this issue seriously and investigate and prosecute cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women. But probably the most impactful moment of that candlelight vigil was when Florence Choyo spoke and shared the story of her daughter Monica, who was murdered during a domestic violence action in the Keens Canyon on the Hopi Reservation. As to myself, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, I'm an attorney, and I'm a direct descendant of a tribal leader, my great-great-great-grandfather, who in the 1820s, as Speaker of our Tribal Council, worked to create and establish our Cherokee Nation Supreme Court and pass a law that criminalized the rape of any woman on Cherokee lands, regardless of the identity or race, citizenship of the perpetrator. I'm a direct descendant of a tribal leader who understood the connection between tribal sovereignty and safety for Native women, and that understanding informs and commands the work that I undertake today. I think all of our written testimony, the testimony of my colleagues today, underscores the depth of this crisis, the fact that our women are murdered 10 times the national rate on reservations. In addition to that incredibly high rate of violence, we also know that the majority, this is from a statistic from the DOJ, National Institute of Justice, the majority of violent crimes committed against Native women are committed by non-Indians. So even though our members of our own nations and our communities are committing these crimes, we have a huge crisis of non-Indian perpetrated violence against Native women. And because in 1978 the Supreme Court eliminated tribal jurisdiction, this has only exacerbated the crisis that, as Professor Deere mentioned, has been accumulating over hundreds of years since 1492. However, when we look at the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, the jurisdictional loophole is a major source of the high rates of violence against our women and the lack of a response. Because of this Supreme Court decision in 1978 and the current legal framework for a tribal nation to undertake and arrest and prosecute a perpetrator who has murdered or kidnapped a Native woman, the tribal government must, for jurisdictional purposes, determine that the identity of the perpetrator is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, an Indian. And if they cannot determine that, that paralyzes tribal law enforcement and a tribal government from working to protect their own citizens. This is the case so often. It was the case with Olivia Lone Bear. When she went missing in October of 2017, her tribal nation could not determine whether or not it had jurisdiction simply because they could not identify the identity of the perpetrator. And although her brother, Matthew Lone Bear, repeatedly demanded that all state, tribal, and federal officials act immediately to locate her and to search for her, it wasn't until 10 months later, after he'd been asking for 10 months for the federal authorities to search all bodies of water on the reservation, that they found her deceased in her truck at the bottom of Lake Sakakawea. So often when one of our women or girls goes missing, it is our family members and our friends who undertake the search to rescue her, not law enforcement. That has to change. So it's not only a jurisdictional issue, it's the lack of response from the federal authorities who oftentimes under the current legal framework do have jurisdiction and yet do nothing. Another major issue that I've written much about in my written testimony and what the NIWRC recommends is more access to the National Criminal Information System, NCIC. Currently today, only 47 tribal nations have access to this database. This database is a critical tool anytime a Native woman goes missing or is murdered for justice. And right now, the lack of access that tribes have with only 47 of the 573 federally recognized tribes having access is a huge impediment. Finally, lack of resources. So many of our tribal nations do not have adequate funding for their own law enforcement as well as victim services. As the NIWRC has stated publicly for many years and advocated, we are working so hard to fund victim services because we have to deal with the crisis of domestic violence and sexual assault. Oftentimes, those crimes escalate to murder and homicide. So we need funding for our victim services and our tribal law enforcement. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Well done.
Thank you, Ms. Nagel. Next, we have Ms. Tammy Giroux. She's the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center.
Tammy Truitt Giroux. I have to push that. Thank you for inviting me to testify on this important issue today. I'm an enrolled citizen of a small Degaton Athabascan village in the interior of Alaska. I'm a mother, a grandmother, an auntie, as well as the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW, is a far too common occurrence and recently has received much attention due to the many raised voices having put the issue in the public eye. Unfortunately, MMIW didn't just start happening a few years ago, but it's been happening since the first contact. There are many stories and experiences of Alaska Native women and girls that have faced victimization just because they're Indigenous. Too many of our relatives have suffered abuse and death because of a government system that fails in their legal trust and moral responsibility to assist Indigenous nations in safeguarding the lives of our women and children. There are many stories, such as the 20-year-old Sophie Sergi, who traveled to Fairbanks from her small Yupik village in western Alaska in 1993. She went to visit her friend at the University of Alaska. She left the room to go outside and never returned. She was eventually found, sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, shot in the back of the head in a dormitory bathroom. Unfortunately, for 25 years, there had been no justice. And until recently, a DNA was linked from a genetic genealogy site, which uses family genetic history to find suspects. The DNA was linked to a student who attended the university in the 1990s and is now a nurse working in Maine. Finally, an arrest was made for this heinous crime 25 years ago. However often, we have no choice and no closure with many of our women who die unexpectedly and unnaturally. The manner of death, while it is far too often considered suspicious and often with visible injuries, is classified as accidental, suicidal, or undetermined. In the village of Kloak, police suspected foul play and the unnatural death of Francile Ella Turpin, 37, on January 14, 2018. A year later, there is no resolution. Why is it that our women and families do not get the closure regarding cause of death that the general population takes for granted? Maybe because 40% of our communities have no law enforcement or even have 911 services to speak of. So who do they call? The first responders are often volunteer medics who their first inclination is to address the injury. The possibility that there could be a crime committed is not even contemplated, and the scene can easily be contaminated before a semi-qualified individual can preserve the scene. Often, first responders are the tribal chief or volunteer advocates who are tasked to preserve crime scenes. Why do our women and girls go missing or murdered at such high rates? I believe that's a simple but complicated question. The tragic truth is that the impact of colonization, past and current laws and policies, and natural resources development have endangered Alaska Native women and children. Oftentimes, the attitude of people coming into our lands is that the lack of infrastructure, such as local police and services normally in place that offer protection and justice systems to hold perpetrators of crimes accountable, do not exist in our tribal communities. A mixed message is sent that it is okay to commit crimes against Native people and there will be no consequences. Sadly, the long history and belief that Native people are less valuable and a barrier to land and resource development, and American Indian and Alaska Native women who are objectified and considered of little importance. As for the missing and murdered persons and homicides of Alaska Natives, Alaska has the highest number of any state, and these are not per capita numbers. Areas that would help decrease these statistics is to continue funding organizations such as ourselves, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, which we are developing a community engagement toolkit to address when a person goes missing or dies by unnatural death. This plan will help tribal communities respond. We cannot wait for the state or federal government to act. We need a jurisdictional fix in Alaska's Indian country issue in which 228 out of 229 tribes are without territorial jurisdiction and regular and consistent tribal justice and tribal law enforcement funding in Alaska through the Indian Tribal Support Act. The bipartisan group of co-sponsors in the Senate has introduced Savannah's Act, S227, which includes several provisions aimed at improving the response to the cases of missing and murdered women in tribal communities. However, how it's written now would exclude half of the tribes and needs to address Alaska tribes particularly. Provide sufficient federal support for effective and culturally appropriate services to Indigenous women, survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, including to the provision of victim services, rape crisis, and transitional housing. When Indigenous women do not have adequate services and safe housing, they are placed at risk. Provide permanent access to the Crime Victims Fund for victims' assistance and compensation. The House needs a bill similar to the Senate's Survive Act. Fully implement VAWA 2005 program of research, and specifically regarding the disappearance and murders of Native women. We need a baseline study for Alaska, as statistics prove our situation is worse and maybe different than lower 48. And finally, support tribal amendments to H.R. 1585 VAWA reauthorization, including a pilot project similar to the one created in VAWA 2013, wherein Alaska tribes can exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. There is a unique opportunity to recognize these issues and make corrections to the laws to support the nation's First Peoples. Dokaden.
Thank you so much to all of our witnesses. Great. Again, I want to thank the expert witnesses for their powerful testimony, reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a five-minute limit on questions. The Chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask of the witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes, and we will alternate to our ranking member and go on from there. Thank you again for witnesses. This has been, I think, very difficult for many of us to listen, but very much necessary. Professor Deere, in your testimony, you mentioned the Sovereign Bodies Institute, a nonprofit Native-owned and operated organization. What is the importance of having organizations such as SBI work on data gathering projects related to MMIW? And two, how accessible is this information to federal agencies?
Thank you for that question. I believe that it's critical that Native people are at the forefront of this effort. Even if we were to receive federal funding, it still should be that tribal members and families and survivors should drive the data collection. And one of the reasons is for cultural reasons. If someone is going to add a name of a missing loved one to a data set, there is sometimes a need for ceremony, feasts that are associated with that. So if it's the federal government collecting the data, they're not necessarily in the position of providing that. And so we do need, while federal data would be helpful, I really believe that the forefront should be led by Indigenous women, survivors, and their families. I think that nonprofits can partner with federal agencies, but it needs